The voice came first. Soft, high, almost weightless. It floated through the room like a promise, the kind that makes people stop talking and lean closer. But long before the applause, before the studio lights and platinum records, that voice belonged to a child who learned very early how to disappear. In one house, music meant survival. In that same house, silence meant fear. The world would later celebrate a gifted singer from one of the most talented R&B families of a generation. Radio listeners would fall in love with melodies, harmonies, and a falsetto that sounded effortless. But behind that sound was a story no one wanted to hear. A story shaped by violence, shame, and years of pain that never found an exit. This is not just a story about fame, and it is not just a story about addiction. It is about what happens when extraordinary talent grows inside an unsafe home, about what happens when success arrives before healing, and about how the music industry applauds the voice, but often ignores the person carrying it. So before we talk about charts, contracts, or hit records, there is one question we have to ask. What does a child become when music is the only place he feels safe? He was born into a house where love and fear lived side by side. Detroit, Michigan, mid-1950s, a working-class city humming with factories, gospel choirs, and unspoken tension. It was here that Robert Louis DeBarge Jr. entered the world, a child of two Americas. His father was white, his mother was black, and in that era, that alone placed the family in a dangerous in-between. Inside the home, the danger was constant. His father ruled through violence, not discipline, violence, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and an atmosphere so heavy that even silence felt unsafe. Of all the children, Bobby endured the worst of it. The kind of trauma that doesn't end when the door closes because it follows you into adulthood, into relationships, into how you see yourself. His mother tried to leave. More than once. She called the police. More than once. But in those years, a black woman with 10 children had very few places to turn. The system did not protect her. And it certainly did not protect her children. With nowhere to go and no safety net, she returned, again and again, to the same house that was breaking them. At school and in the neighborhood, the DeBarge children were outsiders. Too black for some spaces, too light for others. They learned early how to adapt, how to read a room, how to survive without being fully accepted anywhere. Music became the refuge. Church, their voices finally mattered. Harmony replaced shouting. Rhythm replaced chaos. The DeBarge children could hear a song once and play it back by ear. It wasn't practice, it was instinct. For Bobby, music wasn't a hobby. It was the one place where his body and mind felt briefly free. By high school, Bobby and his older brother Tommy were already performing with local acts around Detroit. Clubs, small gigs, anywhere that would let them play. Bobby gravitated toward the piano, but it was his voice, that delicate, almost unreal falsetto, that stopped people mid-conversation. Then came opportunity. In the mid-1970s, Bobby landed a job playing piano for a rising artist named Verrill White. It looked like the door was finally opening. But when White went solo, Bobby stayed behind. And without structure, without support, the past rushed back in. Heroin found him before success did. While the others pushed forward, chasing demos, chasing labels, chasing California, Bobby remained in Detroit, trapped in addiction and isolation. It was a familiar pattern. When life slowed down, the pain caught up. The group moved on without him. For a moment, it looked like Bobby would be left behind permanently. But fate intervened in the most unexpected way. In Los Angeles, Bobby's friends stepped into an elevator with Jermaine Jackson and his wife, Hazel Gordy. They handed over a demo. Within 24 hours, the phone rang. Jermaine wanted to sign them. There was only one problem. They needed Bobby. The group reached out, asking him to rejoin. This time, Bobby did what few expected. He got clean. He kicked the habit long enough to show up ready. When he arrived in Los Angeles, he wasn't just sober. He was focused. At the audition for Berry Gordy and Motown executives, something rare happened. The band seamlessly switched instruments and lead vocals mid-song. It was effortless, tight, electric. Gordy saw it immediately. They named the group Switch, a reflection of their versatility, and signed on the spot. For the first time in his life, Bobby felt chosen. Not for survival, but for talent. What no one could see yet was this. The wounds he carried into that room had never healed. They were simply quiet. And quiet pain, when paired with sudden success, has a way of resurfacing when no one is ready. Success arrived quickly, almost too quickly. When Switch released their self-titled debut album in 1978, the response was immediate. The sound was smooth yet daring, polished yet emotional. But it was the voice, Bobby's voice, that lingered. A falsetto so clean it felt unreal. It didn't shout. It didn't beg. It seduced quietly. Their single "There'll Never Be" climbed into the top 10 on the R&B charts, pushing the album to platinum status. For Bobby, it was a moment he had imagined since childhood. The applause, the validation, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, the past no longer defined him. On stage, he looked confident. Off stage, the story was more complicated. Switch stood out not just for their sound, but for their versatility. They could trade instruments mid-song, switch lead vocals without breaking momentum. Motown executives loved it. Audiences did too. By the time their second album, Switch 2, dropped in 1979, featuring the hit "I Call Your Name," the group had solidified their place in R&B's upper tier. Rumors swirled that Bobby had written that song for LaToya Jackson, whom he was romantically involved with at the time. Whether true or not, the relationship mattered to him. It made him feel seen, connected to a world that had once felt unreachable. When that relationship ended, something shifted. Friends noticed the change immediately. Bobby withdrew. The old darkness crept back in, quietly at first. Fame had given him money and recognition, but it hadn't given him peace. And without peace, the noise inside grew louder. He began using drugs again, not casually but compulsively. Heroin wasn't just an escape. It was familiar. It numbed memories he never learned how to process. And as his drug use increased, so did his inner conflict. Bobby struggled deeply with his sexuality. In an era where masculinity in R&B was tightly policed, there was no safe space for honesty. He began spending time in gay bars, living a double life marked by secrecy and shame. The pressure of hiding from fans, from peers, from family took its toll. Addiction fed the isolation. Isolation fed the addiction. Success, instead of saving him, amplified everything he had tried to bury. By 1980, Motown had signed the DeBarge siblings, and history was in the making. Their younger brothers and sister were on the verge of becoming one of the most beloved family groups of the decade. For Bobby, this should have been a triumphant moment. It wasn't. Because of contractual obligations with Switch, Bobby and his brother Tommy couldn't join the DeBarge group immediately. Watching his family rise while he stood on the sidelines reopened old wounds. He had helped pave the way, yet he couldn't be part of the moment. Motown offered him a solo deal, but his drug use made him unreliable. Sessions were missed, commitments broken. Eventually, the label walked away. Another door closed, and when the industry stops calling, reality hits hard. Without steady income, without structure, and without support, Bobby spiraled. Music, once his refuge, became a reminder of everything slipping away. Desperate for money, he and his younger brother Chico turned to selling drugs. It wasn't ambition. It was survival mixed with resignation. The fall was quiet, but it was complete. In 1988, Bobby was arrested in Grand Rapids, Michigan, on drug charges. The sentence was 5 years in prison. For someone whose life had always swung between chaos and music, incarceration was a breaking point. Behind bars, there was no stage, no applause, no illusion of control. When Bobby came home, he carried more than a criminal record. He carried illness. According to his brother Chico, Bobby was living with AIDS, a diagnosis that, in that era, came with fear, stigma, and isolation. The same society that once applauded his voice now looked away. The tragedy of Bobby DeBarge isn't just that he rose and fell. It's that his fall began long before fame ever found him. The industry celebrated the sound, but never asked what it cost him to create it. And by the time the world realized how broken he was, it was already too late. By the late 1980s, the spotlight was gone. No tour buses, no studio sessions, no one waiting outside with contracts or promises. What remained was a man alone with habits that had once been hidden behind success. Selling drugs with his younger brother Chico was never part of a plan. It was a reaction to financial pressure, to emotional exhaustion, to a career that had stalled without warning. When the music stopped paying, survival took over. And survival, when driven by desperation, often leads to decisions that close doors permanently. In 1988, those doors slammed shut. Bobby was arrested in Grand Rapids, Michigan, on drug-related charges. The sentence was 5 years in prison. For the public, it was a headline that passed quickly. For Bobby, it was the moment when the last illusion of control disappeared. Prison stripped everything down to the bone. There was no escape through music. No applause to drown out memories. The trauma from childhood, the abuse, the confusion, the shame, resurfaced without warning. And inside an environment built on dominance and silence, vulnerability was dangerous. According to his brother Chico, Bobby contracted HIV during his time in prison. The exact circumstances were never publicly confirmed, but in that era, the stigma surrounding AIDS was brutal. Whether through shared needles or sexual contact, the diagnosis came with fear layered on top of fear. AIDS in the late 1980s wasn't just a medical condition. It was a social sentence. When Bobby was released, he came home with hope, fragile but real. He wanted to make music again. He talked about chords, arrangements, possibilities. For a moment, it seemed like there might still be time. But his body had begun to betray him. The illness weakened him. The stress accelerated it. And the world he returned to had little patience for second chances, especially for black men, former inmates, and artists whose names no longer guaranteed profit. There was no comeback machine waiting. Friends noticed how quiet he had become. The sharpness in his eyes dulled. His once effortless voice struggled against fatigue. And yet, even then, there were flashes, moments where the old Bobby surfaced, humming melodies, touching keys as if muscle memory could outlast disease. What hurt most wasn't just the illness. It was the isolation. In the music industry, attention is currency. When it disappears, so does concern. Bobby's story unfolded largely out of public view. No benefit concerts, no major media reckoning. Just a slow fading watched only by family and a few who still cared. By the early 1990s, AIDS had already claimed countless lives, particularly within marginalized communities. Fear kept people distant. Silence replaced compassion. And for someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to disappear, that silence felt familiar and final. On August 16, 1995, Bobby DeBarge died from complications related to AIDS. He was 39 years old, too young to be remembered as a legend, too wounded to be saved by fame, and too human to survive a system that celebrated his gift but never protected the person behind it. His death barely made noise outside his circle. No charts marked the loss. No award shows paused to reflect. Yet for those who knew his voice and those who understood his struggle, the absence was profound. Because Bobby DeBarge wasn't just another artist who fell to addiction. He was a child who never escaped what was done to him. A man who carried pain longer than success. And a reminder of how easily brilliance can be lost when trauma goes untreated. In the United States of the 1980s and early 1990s, stories like Bobby's were rarely told with compassion. America was changing, but slowly. The music industry moved fast. Society did not. When AIDS entered the public conversation, it arrived wrapped in fear. It was labeled before it was understood. For many Americans, especially outside major cities, the disease was discussed in whispers, if it was discussed at all. For black communities, the silence was even heavier. Resources were scarce. Education was limited. Stigma was brutal. For black men, former inmates, and artists whose fame had faded, the margin for empathy was thin. Bobby DeBarge lived at the intersection of all three. There was little room in mainstream media for nuance. Childhood abuse was not openly discussed. Male victims were rarely acknowledged. Sexual identity, especially within R&B and soul music, was expected to fit a narrow image of masculinity. Anything outside that image was pushed into the shadows. So when Bobby disappeared from the charts, America barely noticed. Internationally, the story wasn't much different. While European audiences often embraced soul and R&B artists long after American radio moved on, Bobby's decline happened too quietly, too privately, to spark a global reckoning. There were no documentaries at the time, no public conversations about how trauma, addiction, and illness intersected with fame. The world consumed the music, not the pain. And that is perhaps the most telling part of his story. Bobby DeBarge did not fail because he lacked talent. He didn't fall because he lacked opportunity. He was failed by systems that did not yet know how to protect children, how to treat addiction as illness, or how to speak honestly about AIDS without fear. Only years later would conversations begin to change. Today, audiences look back with different eyes. We talk more openly about mental health, about abuse, about the long-term effects of trauma. But for Bobby, those conversations came too late. His life reminds us that silence can be just as deadly as addiction, that stigma can kill quietly, and that a voice loved by millions can still belong to someone the world refuses to truly hear. When Bobby DeBarge died in the summer of 1995, the world did not stop. There were no breaking news alerts, no tribute specials, no final performance to say goodbye. He was just 39 years old. For some, he was remembered as a troubled artist. For others, he faded quietly into a footnote beneath a family name that continued to shine. But reducing his life to failure misses the truth and the cost. Bobby DeBarge was not simply a man who lost his way. He was a child who was never protected, an artist who was never fully healed, a human being who carried pain longer than he carried success. His voice still lingers, soft, high, unmistakable. It lives in records, in late-night radio memories, in moments when music feels like confession. That falsetto wasn't just beautiful, it was fragile, and fragility, when ignored, doesn't survive. His legacy is not only in what he sang, it's in what his story teaches. It asks uncomfortable questions about how we treat abused children when they grow up, about how we punish addiction instead of treating it, about how quickly society turns away once the applause fades. It reminds us that talent does not erase trauma, and fame does not cure wounds that were never acknowledged. Today, conversations about mental health, childhood abuse, sexuality, and illness are more open than they once were. That progress matters, but it came too late for Bobby. Maybe the real legacy is this. If we listen closely, not just to the music, but to the silence behind it, we might recognize pain sooner next time. We might respond with care instead of judgment. And we might save someone before their voice becomes only a memory. If the story brought up feelings, you're not alone. If it reminded you of someone you've lost, or someone still fighting, consider sharing their name below. Stories like these deserve to be remembered, not hidden. And if you believe these conversations matter, take a moment to support this channel. Not for fame, not for nostalgia, but to keep telling the stories that were once ignored. Because every voice matters, even the ones the world failed to protect.